Thank you so much for this opportunity, Sujeev. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Kathmandu after 11 years. It's been too long. Every time I visit, I wonder why we aren't here more often. We really should get a lot of our young scholars. This is such an important country for us. We think we know you, but there is so much we need to do. And part of the reason I'm here is also to foster relationship between scholars of the two countries. As someone who's been working in public policy now for 21 years, for me, the new Nepal Economic Forum becomes an important platform and a gateway for the scholars. I'm currently with the Economic Advisory Council. We sit within the Niti Aayog, which is the think tank of the government. But there is a very large and thriving community of think tanks in India. Many of them are young, which makes them extremely agile. The interests are very wide. We're looking at environment, we're looking at connectivity. In fact, I've tried to bring in a lot of data even in the international relations and the foreign policy side of scholarship while I was at Brookings for 10 years. My core interest, however, is India and the neighborhood. Part of my job when I was invited was to give you a sense of how the Indian economy is transforming. Over and beyond a handful of macro indicators that you talk about all the time, the media talks about all the time, I'm here to really give you a snapshot of a very broad range of the real economy. And by real, I mean as against merely the financial sector or the size of the economy. And before I begin to do that, I do want to spend a minute on Bibek. I've had the great opportunity to work with him as a part-time member in the Economic Advisory Council when it was formed under Modi administration in 2017. I was a part-time member then. I was younger, I was more impatient, and it took someone like Bibek to really guide me and mentor me to really understand how things function within the government and how do you get government and the administration to open windows to accept research insights. Traditionally, I think it's by nature, bureaucracy is conservative, and it's the case definitely in India. Despite the political big movements and the aspirations themselves, which are exploding, bureaucracy has its own pace of life, and researchers sometimes do feel frustrated. But I think what Bibek taught me in the last 8-9 years is that, we have to be prepared with our insight and the research itself with the ideas, preferably in a translational format, in an application format. And when the window of opportunity opens, we are ready to plug these ideas in. Because dynamic economies like India, Nepal, in fact, the entire neighborhood, are opening in ways which aren't always predictable. There are new windows of opportunity opening, and I think as scholars, the job really becomes one of having good, thorough ideas prepared and ready to just plug in. So I do think that the time is right for scholars to rise and shine and to publish, particularly I think across disciplines and across countries. I will give you a snapshot of some of that. One small comment on Bibek's scholarship, Sujeev, that we often forget is, while he translated tons and tons of Sanskrit texts, the Puranas, the Mahabharata, and so on, as an elder and as a mentor, there is a lot of knowledge which is not documented. Have patience. He's a good person, but don't always trust him. This person will tend to sit on the file. These are things that nobody else really prepares you for, and this is where it matters to have a research community, to have a scholarly community which builds on existing. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants here. So he was a giant, and many of us in the economic and the public policy realm of India and modern Indian policy making, we are definitely going to miss him tremendously. So thank you for remembering him, and thank you for getting me here. I'll start first with why growth. Now, this is particularly for a lot of my European friends, and When I visit Europe, I hear about degrowth. I hear about, yes, issues of sustainability can be addressed if we grow slowly, or there is a concept of degrowing. Let me make it very clear. In India, growth is non-negotiable. We have to grow. We have just come out of poverty. So for us, we are still under $3,000 per capita per year, which means growth for us is an absolute necessity. To give you an idea of where we are, just 48 years back, really 2 generations, an average South Korean, an average Chinese, and an average Indian had the same per capita income. Today, South Korea is 12 times richer and China is 4.5 times richer in per capita terms. None of these are forces of nature. They don't just happen. Growth is an outcome of deliberate policy making and reforms. So growth is not something that is random and that just happens. It is very much an outcome of what we do. And that's the larger message when we look at growth and compare with some of our fast-growing countries within Asia. This is, of course, India, per capita income of India, and it's a very impressive trajectory. The reflex answer to the question, when did India's exponential growth phase start? The reflex answer that most economists also tend to give is 1991, when we began to liberalize. However, that is not the case. That is the time when we began to dismantle the core license permit Raj. We had an extremely inhibiting, extremely limiting economic regime where private enterprise to a large extent was inhibited by the policies, and the government was a very active player. In 91, we began to dismantle the license permit Raj, but the inflection point is around 2000. So the lesson is that it takes a little while after you change the rules for growth to pick up. That's number one. But number two, merely changing the rules doesn't do the trick. You need the government to make large capital expenditure in very important sectors like infrastructure. It was in late 1990s and 2000, it was really the Vajpayee regime around which we saw connecting every nook and cranny of the country through major highway networks. We saw privatization of airlines. We saw power sector reform when India went from being a power deficient country to becoming a power surplus country. We saw the telecom reforms. Of course, what people remember today are the scams and so on, but we often forget how revolutionary the reforms within the telecom sector was. We used to wait 6 months to get a telephone connectivity. Now, on average, an Indian citizen, let's say in Delhi, Bombay, has 2 phones or perhaps 3. Every household has multiple. So this trajectory is not very old, but it is now consistent. India continues to be the fastest growing major economy in the world since the pandemic. And every year, the IMF projections, the OECD projections, the World Bank projections, they're all projecting India in ways that it often needs to be corrected, and the corrections are always upwards. So in fact, if anything, we are far more conservative than the true dynamic nature of the economy itself. But not to be over-reliant on GDP as a metric, we should look at the human development metric as well. Human development looks at indicators of health, education, gender. And this is when you compare India with China here. Unlike in the economic growth, where we are roughly 20 to 22 years behind China, in terms of the human development indicators, it's almost like a parallel line. Here, the horizontal difference tells you how many years behind. We are roughly 8 years behind China. And that itself is a very important thing to note, that while economically we are 22 years, why is it that developmentally we are doing relatively better? And I think the democratic structure of the country, the fact that we have elections which cannot be won if you ignore development altogether. Whether it's a federal level, so central government elections, whether it is a panchayat election, every election, development and indicators of local development become a very important electoral tool. Of course, that might have its own bag of problems where you have too much populist moves. But this, in fact, the outcome is that development in India is happening at a far more rapid pace. If you look at the world poverty clock, it's remarkable that despite the pandemic, we remained one of the few major countries which continued to be on the target to achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 1, which is reduction of absolute poverty, right? Today, this is the latest data as of spring of 2024. India's absolute poverty is now below 3%. And we have all grown up studying the slogan, Garibi Hatao. Everyone talks of poverty in India, but it has taken us this long, and therefore we are at a very historic time window when India has actually managed to reduce absolute poverty below 3%. It truly is a historic achievement. Of course, a lot of it is on the back of rapid economic growth. The other point to note is far richer countries, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, many of them are going to miss the SDG 1 target on account of COVID. So it's not how much wealth or how wealthy the country is. It's how the economic progress takes everyone along. That's why we care so much about poverty. So we are far poorer than these richer countries, which are 3x, 4x per capita GDP. But we have managed to attain SDG 1, which is below 3% absolute poverty. If you look at maternal mortality rate, which is yet another important metric to look at, the number of mothers who die during childbirth, India's reduction of maternal mortality rate is more than twice as fast as the global average. So the orange bars are the maternal mortality rate for the global economy, and the blue bars are for India. This again is happening, of course, largely on the back of economic growth, but remember, it's a very large country. Many of our SDGs are not all India level problems anymore. 10 states in India have already attained the IMR, the infant mortality and the maternal mortality. So we have concentrated 6 states or 7 states where this problem persists. So we are really in the realm of what we call precision policy making now. That's why you'll hear of aspirational districts. You'll hear of aspirational blocks. There are very few big all India level goals of this nature. This is infant mortality rate. The size of the ball indicates the size of the population. These are states of India. You'll see the poorest states on the right-hand side, the southern states in the middle, and on the left you'll see the rest. You see every state of the country, and on the y-axis you have per capita GDP. With economic growth in every state, infant mortality rate is really crashing. The biggest increases are in poor states like Odisha, Bihar, UP, etc. For us, this is what economic growth is. Sometimes when you pick up the newspapers and you hear India is getting intolerant, violent, and so on, as economists, we really look for objective measures to look at these things. So you study riots. A riot is a variable which is very well defined, and it doesn't change over time. A riot is a violent episode which involves 5 or more people for a common purpose, and it gets registered in the local police station. If you see since the 50s and 60s, India in the late 80s and early 90s used to see more than 1 lakh, which is more than 100,000 riots a year. Do you see the structural decline since economic growth started? And as economists, of course, there are lots of theory, but a very compelling one is that the opportunity cost of street violence has now increased. So it's not that we have started doing policing particularly well, or we've started spending a lot more on policing. We've had various kinds of reforms even within the police, but that's not the story. The story here is the tolerance for a lot of street violence has come down. So you are seeing that the number of riots, in fact, today, India is far more peaceful than we have been in the last 50 years if you just measure riots. Of course, we are all on cell phones, and one riot is one too many. We are a highly hyper-connected world today. But objectively, if you see, far, far more peaceful. If you see crime against women, these are all the states, you see that rapes, again, because it's well-defined, the definitions don't change with time, you're seeing there's been a structural break. Around 2016-17, most states, though not all, have seen a structural break in terms of number of rapes. These are BJP states, Congress states, RJD states, JDU states, regardless of the political parties. And one very compelling research that came out was published in The Lancet, which showed that it was the building of 120 million rural toilets, which led to a reduction of 22% in assaults on women and 14% reduction in rapes or reported rapes. So the toilets, which were built because many of us argued for why open defecation has direct impact with health and public health metrics, has had a very important unintended consequence. It has had on safety of women and girls. And that's the nature of policy making, that we push for a particular intervention based on certain insights, certain empirical truths, facts, what we find across the developing world, maybe developed world. But there are many other aspects to these interventions which are quite unintended. So today what you're seeing, and particularly in rural India, is safety for girls and women has gone up on account of these. Toilets have been a very major scheme. Now, in terms of self-reliance, because you do hear Make in India, self-reliant India, Atmanirbhar, that's the Hindi term for it, which means self-reliance. There are some sectors which are of strategic interest to us, in which we want to be self-reliant. We do not want to be over-dependent on any other power. Food is the first. What you notice is in terms of the food production index, that's the left-hand side panel, 100, it measures of the amount and the food that you eat, how much do you produce. We used to be barely 23, 30. Today we are 126, which means we are producing far more than what we are consuming. In terms of basic cereals, India has a problem of abundance today. We are trying to now diversify away from cereals towards other kind of crops. And so we are also looking at the nutritional outcomes. How does the minimum support price, etc., how do you alter cropping pattern? Right? So today, we are self-sufficient as far as food is concerned. If you look at the second panel, it tells you what fraction of our imports is food. 1/3 of our imports used to be food just 40, 50 years back. Today, it's around 2.3%. It'll never be zero, remember, because we are a connected country. We are a country which is increasingly opening to the rest of the world. We have lots of trade and investment treaties with many, many countries. We will never be zero because we are not insular. We have a community. In fact, you should think of the Indian economy as having the size and scale of a Germany combined with 2 sub-Saharan Africa. Which means there is a cohort, there is a demographic which consumes like Germany, which travels like Germany, which adopts technology like Germany. So we do like our Swiss cheeses and New Zealand milk products and etc. So it will never be zero. We are not going back to pre-1991 phase, right? But our domestic economy, unlike China, is a strategic asset for us. Unlike a repressed domestic demand, which becomes particularly vulnerable to global turmoils. That's why you're seeing the slowdown in China, also on account of global, but there are other reasons, overcapacity, etc. For us, the Indian economy, domestic demand is a very, very important factor. And that's why you see that the impact of global turmoil is relatively less on Indian economy compared to the Chinese, or most other emerging market for that matter. Now, if you look at energy, oil. And this will perhaps help you appreciate why our foreign policy has been shaped almost entirely on what our needs are, domestic needs are. Again, I reiterate, we have just come out of poverty. We have great need for high economic growth over the next several decades, hence non-negotiable. What you see is the per capita consumption in energy. It's just shooting up. In fact, now it has totally escalated. That's what a poor, fast-growing economy looks like. Our energy consumption is shooting. But if you look at what fraction of our energy consumed is imported, and we compare ourselves with 3 major economies like China and the US, you're seeing that in the case of Chinese, their energy dependence has stabilized around 13, 14% over the last several years now. The US, since shale, of course, but strategically now they're weaning themselves away from over-dependence on imports for energy needs. So you're seeing now it's down to single digits. It's around 6.5, 6.7, I think. In India, if you see the imported segment of our energy, we are around 33% of our energy is really imported. That's very high, and it shows no sign of slowing down. Hence, our energy security is going to dictate a lot of our stance. You know, manufacturing, I must confess, we have had a complete 180-degree reorientation. If you were in Delhi 10 years back, the common phrase you would hear people in Delhi speak is that India has missed the manufacturing bus. Because China is doing so much of it and they're competitive, we're not going to be able to keep up. But since the Modi administration has come in, there's been, of course, a lot of research and of course, the world today is a new world if you look at what's happening across. We see resurgence of what we call industrial policy in most developed countries of the world. And industrial policy really is euphemism for saying, look, we want our manufacturing jobs back. And the government is going to spend money and resources and strategically get a lot of these manufacturing capabilities back home. Because we have realized after much turmoil globally that manufacturing sector is not just about producing something cheaply. It's also about livelihoods. It's about jobs. And the kind of upheaval we are seeing in Western Europe and in the US on account of loss of manufacturing jobs, we clearly want to avoid that. That's number one. Number two, as China loses its competitive advantage in terms of rising labor costs, and of course the slowdown overall, India begins to emerge as that second large market with this massive labor surplus, which has the capability to plug into this next phase. But remember, while China's growth in manufacturing was backed by the OECD market, the rest of the world continues to grow. Africa is growing, Latin America is growing, Asia is growing. And the demand for manufactured items, and I'm not talking about the extremely high-tech, even simple manufactured items, is continuing to rise. And we do need another engine. And India is well poised to do that. But remember, it's a large country. We have many states, and states are very powerful in India. A federal structure becomes then a very important factor when you begin to understand manufacturing capability within India. Then, of course, we have 500 million people whom we have to move out of agriculture. So manufacturing, therefore, becomes of strategic interest. Services is not going to be able to employ such a large number. While services remains the fastest growing and the engine of growth for the Indian economy, strategically, manufacturing becomes very, very important. So there has been a complete reorientation. Therefore, schemes like PLI and Make in India Defense, privatization, opening up of the space sector, opening up of almost all sectors in the economy today to private investments and foreign direct investments. On connectivity, you know, it's a new India. If you consider that in the last 10 years, every Indian now has a bank account, an Aadhaar, which is a biometric electronic ID, and mobile access. So we are a networked economy, quite unlike what we were 10 years back. And some of the fastest growing sectors, ag tech, health tech, ed tech, right? The entire startup space is all backed or all serviced on this core architecture, which is digitized India. The fact that every Indian is part of this network today. You hear the government side of the story, which is that we do welfare far better now and more efficiently because the leakages have come down. In fact, the leakages have come down and the savings are in tune of 1.5% of India's GDP. That's what we are saving by plugging leakages and doing direct benefit transfer where the government puts money into the bank account of the beneficiary. But that's the government side of the story. The more vibrant and really the fascinating side is the private sector. The fact that every Indian is now networked and has bank account and has mobile connectivity means there is a very large segment of the economy where there is tremendous trial and error, experimentation we've never seen before. And I often joke that, you know, when we were in colleges, the cool kids had bands and you had a guitar and you sang. Not anymore. The cool kids have startups. So if you go to the business schools, you have incubators and they're so well connected. The financing is coming in so smoothly. You have specialized institutions which are looking at incubating these kind of startups across different sectors of the economy: health, education, infrastructure. So it's a great new economy backed by this. The fastest growing e-commerce segment is not Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad, Chennai. It's Lucknow, Raipur, right? It's all these smaller parts. It's basically because Indians are now part of the network. If you look at any amenity, and this is a conscious government decision, that every basic amenity is now going to be available to all Indians everywhere. We call this the saturation policy, which includes electrification, piped drinking water, of course, toilets, bank account, mobile connectivity. This basket keeps expanding. But what you see is there is no difference in terms of improvements across different socioeconomic groups. You can look at Hindu households, Muslim households, OBCs, SCSTs, whatever. And mind you, this is not government data. These are survey data. More than 12 lakh households. These are self-reported data from households. So the improvements are tremendous. It's a large economy where not every state is growing at the same pace. That's why you will hear stories like Punjab. So Punjab is the dark black line. You see the entire neighborhood of Punjab is growing much, much faster. Haryana today is nearly 3 times richer than Punjab. So the whole country is not growing together. There are very, very big variations across, right? India is again very large. There is no north-south divide as far as wealth is concerned. This is a dynamic graph where every green dot indicates 1,000 rich households, a yellow dot indicates 1,000 middle-class household, and a red dot indicates 1,000 poor households. What you notice, though, is you can draw a line from Srinagar to Kanyakumari. India has an east-west divide as far as growth and wealth is concerned. Our poverty is by and large an eastern phenomenon, while industrialization and rapid growth is happening if you look at the entire western belt, because historically that has been the more industrialized areas. Industrialization begets further industrialization and experimentation. This is where a very large amount of modern industries, etc., are coming in. A lot of our national policies, therefore, you cannot have a national rural employment guarantee scheme in Bihar and Assam, which looks the same as it does in Maharashtra and Gujarat. Nobody is willing to till land for a minimum price in Gujarat and Maharashtra. But it works perfectly fine in Assam and Bihar. So a lot of our national schemes, therefore, like I said, we are getting into precision policy making now. Very few all India level simple schemes. Labor force participation rising, though not as fast as we would like. It's rising for all cohorts, men and women. If you look at overall unemployment rate, of course, it's declining. It's around 3.8 as of the latest number. We do have a problem of youth unemployment. The second panel is of people under the age of 30. It's again a global phenomenon. The OECD euphemistically calls it youth inactivity, which means young people are not ready to settle down into jobs the way we were. They want to wait. They're waiting for the right job, all right? This is very much an Indian phenomenon as well. If you look at satellite data, alternate forms of data, which is not government or self-reported, but just how much of growth is happening, you see the red parts are places where you have growth beyond 5. The average there is around 10% growth year on year. Do you see how the red part of the country is expanding? So very rapid economic growth happening in some of the poorest regions. In fact, if you see our entire boundary, Sujeev, is red. So some of the fastest growing segments of the Indian market is the boundaries along Nepal. And this is the great opportunity. We have to think of how do we use this connectivity which is within and across states within India to basically bolster the same across the border with Nepal. I will end on something called narrative economics. As an economist, my job is also to introduce you to certain areas of economics which are no longer within the realm of corporate finance. In corporate finance, we used to study narrative economics, which is firms would plant stories. They would plant stories about themselves, and they would plant stories about rivals, because it had direct impact on the share price. So while something which was very common in corporate finance, now there is a book that Robert Shiller has written from Harvard called Narrative Economics, and we are applying it now to geoeconomics. And I'm presenting here a story from a Brookings paper that we wrote 1 year into the pandemic. The story here begins at the beginning of the pandemic, and the data, this is open source data from Google. It's called the GDELT data. It measures tone of global media. So more than 100 languages, so you have several 100 million data points in this graph. That's why these are so interesting. What you notice is that these are natural language processing which measures whether the news is positive or negative. How negative, how positive. And what you notice at the beginning of the pandemic, all these countries, and I'm looking at, of course, India, China, the US, Sweden, because Sweden was the unique country which did not have a lockdown, remember, and Germany. What you notice is all the countries are getting negative global coverage, because that's the job of the media. The job of the media is to tell sad stories and break bad news. But what you have seen since the pandemic within a year is that there is now a great divergence happening in global media. This is not Indian media, this is not Chinese media, this is not US media, this is global media. All the media that Google has, right, in more than 100 languages. What you notice is the democracies in the world continue to get negative coverage. Again, that's what free press does. What you see with respect to global coverage of China, quite remarkably, has not only pulled away from the democracies, global coverage of China and Chinese economy is now positive. This is not censorship within China. So this is not Chinese media being told to put good stories about the Chinese economy or China as a country. This is media in Ecuador, in New Zealand, in Australia, Sri Lanka, across the world, more than 100 languages. This is narrative economics which is taking fold. Right? You can do a lot more with this data. This is a campaign. Of course, what I'm showing you is for these 5 countries. We can do this for many other countries. Data allows you to do a very large amount of research. I will end it by showing you the second slide on the same story, the source of the news. And what you notice is the dark line, the black line at the bottom. That is the most negative news on India. It's coming from sources that are unknown. And it's the same unknown sources which are also planting the most positive sources on China, as you can see on top. The most positive news on China is also coming from unknown sources. Big data, natural language processing, allows you to do a tremendous, I'm just giving you a very broad snapshot of what the real geoeconomics of today looks like. When you pick up a newspaper and you read an article, you cannot take it as face value. And as researchers, part of our effort is to develop capability within universities, but also within government ministries. We are getting data scientists across some of our central universities, and I'm not talking about IITs. We have lots of youngsters that love to do this kind of work. So we're doing a lot of mapping of where are stories coming from. Why are institutions under attack? How is it linked to economic growth? What are the institutions that are particularly vulnerable? Which are the countries which are particularly vulnerable to these kind of narrative economics? Is this only of academic interest? Unfortunately not. Because when you're sitting at the negotiation table, whether it's a trade deal, and you have human rights put up as the counter, you know there's something more happening. I'm not downplaying human rights. As a plural democracy, we have institutions which are meant to safeguard, and we're extremely concerned about issues like that. But data allows you to pick up What used to be confined to the realm of business today is happening at a global level, and countries are employing what used to be called narrative economics to drive a lot of the narratives on particular countries. Right? And as researchers, our job, this is also a Brookings paper, our job is to continue to just put it out and understand how international relations and trade and economic relations between countries, what are they being driven by? Real factors, but also certain, sometimes manufactured factors. So it's a fascinating new world. I welcome you to this nature of data science, but I also welcome you to read all of these, whatever excites you on this. They're all published papers. They're all available online. They're peer-reviewed articles. And to the younger scholars in the room, I welcome you to join us in furthering some of this research and perhaps, hopefully, also for Nepal. Thank you. Namaskar.